Welcome to H2K Infosys. H2K Infosys is a e-verify business based in Atlanta, Georgia, United States. We provide 100% job-oriented, instructor-led, face-to-face, true live online software training programs. It also includes access to cloud test lab with software tools. We provide live project for you to work on. We also provide assistance with mock interviews, resume preparation and review, and job placement assistance. H2K Infosys is trusted by so many students across the world. H2K Infosys provides world-class services in IT training with real-time project work for corporates and individuals, special IT training for MS students in the United States, software design, development, QA manual and automation, performance testing and maintenance, IT staff augmentation, job placement assistance, and tech support.
All that you need to do is you just need to ask get a session. Whenever you have asked get a session, your container will do all the ground level work for you, and it's not required for you to maintain the session as well. That will be taken care by your container itself. So take a look at this diagram. So the web browser, let us assume that this is the first request. Request from client Steve, it has reached to web container, and the servlet name is name servlet. So for a servlet, your web container creates a thread, and it will provide two objects. The first one is request object, and the next one is response object. And the request object, we have mentioned that it will associate a session, and this will be retrieved by using request.getSession method. So whenever you have asked getSession, your container will generate an ID, and within your session you can put some attributes as well. These are the attributes that I have put in my session. Session.setAttribute method, just like how you have used request.setAttribute method. Your session reference, it's from HTTP session object. If you want to take a look at the ID, there are methods available within your session object, and you can retrieve those ID values, and you can specify how much time your session should be valid. Sometimes within your Bank of America application, once after 4 minutes or 5 minutes, you'll get an error message saying that only 2 minutes left. You are sitting idle and only 2 minutes left. So that means your session will be going to expire within next 2 minutes. So once it has created session and associated some attributes, and your servlet will generate some response, and it will forward the response back to your client. During the response, it will associate your session ID, and it will send to the web browser. For the second request, your web browser should come with the ID, whatever that we have passed previously. By looking at this ID, the web container understands that this is a request from the same client which I have received previously, but this is a different request now. Then let us say this time it was supposed to hand over to login servlet. It will create a separate thread, and it will create request and response object. But at this point of time, web container already know that the request was coming from the same client associated with this ID, and it will verify with the ID within its session pool, and it will retrieve the session object, same session object whichever it has created previously. That means it has the access to all the attributes which are provided with the previous session, and it will associate with the current request. That means now you have the session object with the same client details. So the same client details or the same attributes which you have set with the previous client request, You can just make use of same scenario, same mechanism, and you can switch between any number of pages as long as your session is valid. There are two approaches to maintain the session. The first one is by using cookies, and the next one is HTTP session. Cookies are just like the name value pair. Probably you might have already heard about cookies within your Internet Explorer or browser. Cookies are maintained at the client level. They are available within your temporary settings, and they will be created by your server itself and make it available for subsequent requests from the web browser. But the disadvantage with the with cookies is sometimes cookies might not enabled on the client side, and sometimes cookies have short span. And the next one is, if at all, if you have disabled the cookies and we can't store the cookies on the client side, so subsequent request will be handled as a new request. So that's the reason normally HTTP session object will be used for maintaining the client session. Let us go and change our code. So currently, I just need to ask my request object to get the session. That will be stored with HTTP session object. So instead of using request.get attribute, here you can see that I'm using session.set attribute. So I'm setting the username parameter within my session object. If you want, we can print the session ID as well. Session.getID method you can use. And change our filter, or else it will fail at this level. So now from my login, it will submit to date servlet first, and within my date servlet, I'm creating a session object, and I'm forwarding the request to counter-display.jsp file. This time, I'm not forwarding to counter-display.jsp. I'm forwarding to some other JSP page, which is register.jsp. The register.jsp, it will contain all the information like username, password, first name, last name, designation, salary, and all that stuff. JSP page, which consists of an action called register servlet submitted with a get method. Just like your normal HTML page, but I have just extended by using .jsp. Create one more servlet. Register servlet. So in register servlet, I'm retrieving the session. And I'm trying to print the get ID. Session ID I'm trying to print. Session ID in register servlet. And once I got the session ID, I'm trying to retrieve the attribute. Get attribute is username. Previously, I have set the attribute within my date servlet by using UN. So just make use of the same name, or else you won't be able to retrieve the data. The session.get attribute, the return type is object. So that means you need to downcast to the string value. username in register servlet. Go back to your register.jsp. So within my register.jsp, I'm not at all associating the data, whatever that I have received from my date servlet. Within your HTML itself, you can make use of scriptlet code. So currently, value, I just want to print the value username within my text box. You can write the scriptlet code within value itself. Session dot get attribute of UN. Previously, you have written, go back to your JSP page, counterdisplay.jsp. Here we have used request.getAttribute of UN. We are able to retrieve the parameter here. But currently, we don't have the attribute in request scope. We have the attribute in session scope. The reason for that is I want the attribute to be available for all my resources within the same session. I don't want to set it each and every JSP or each and every servlet level. Within your HTML tags, at any tag, not only at value tag, here also you can write the dynamic display data, the arguments to your out.println statement, which will display the data, but currently the data will display directly to your text box itself. In the same way, password as well. Password was available within request scope. Go back to your date servlet. This is PWD. Now, let us access this in register servlet by using request scope. Your password was available with request scope, but not with session scope. We'll see what happens. PWD. So one parameter was available with request scope and the next one was available with session scope. And both are available for the next level, which is nothing but your JSP level. Because the same request was forwarded to my JSP. The reason for that is I'm using request.getRequestDispatcher and then forward. But once the request has submitted from my register.jsp file to the register servlet, a new request and response objects will get created by the container. So that means whatever the request and response previously available, they are destroyed now. A fresh request and response objects will get created. But as we have asked to maintain the session within my date servlet, the session will be maintained for register servlet request as well. And when you're trying to print the session ID, it will print the same session ID and it will associate the same session object. So that means I have the access to the context attribute, the session attributes, and the same session object will be provided to my second servlet as well. Let us go and execute the login.html file now. So here enter the information as Steve, password also as not Steve. Password mention it as sync. Click on submit button. filter received the request, username printing Steve, do get method called, context value, username received Steve, and password is sync. Finally, the session ID created. You can see that this is the session ID that got created, and currently we are in registration page, and you can see that this information got filled automatically by using your Servlet code, or sorry, expression code. But the client will feel that you have filled the data within your text box, then he'll understand that these two information are available. That's how he'll see. Now I'm clicking on submit. When I clicked on submit, this will create a new request object with all the parameters that are available within my registration page. But currently I'm not going to take any of the parameters at this level. That's the reason I have used UN and PWD instead of username and password, or else they'll be going to generate username and password and make it available. If I click on submit, session ID in register servlet, you can see that same session ID, username in register servlet. The username was available within your session scope. See, don't confuse between username and password at this level. These are just like my form parameters, and I am currently using some other named parameters, some other query parameter names, some other parameter names which I have set within my previous servlet. UN, which I have set in the session scope, PWD, which was available in my request scope. Now I am trying to access the session scope variable, which is UN. You can see that the parameter was available. And I'm trying to access a request scoped parameter, which is PWD. The parameter was not available. The reason for that is it has created a new request and response objects. Whenever it has received new request and response objects, it has created by the web container for my new servlet request, but it was able to associate the same session object. The reason for that is we have already requested a session ID. There are plenty of other methods that are available within your session scope. You can just take a look at them. Get last access time, get maximum inactive interval, and you have the access to your servlet context as well. Is new is useful to verify whether the session was created for the first time by the container or is it coming for the second time. Normally, this is the approach which will be used to identify whether the session has invalid or not. People will verify whether the last access time, get last access time. Then they'll verify the difference between current time and the get lost access time. If the session access time was more than 3 minutes or 4 minutes, then they'll specify that the session has expired and they will ask the user to log in again. In general, there are 4 scopes available. The first one is request scope, next one is application scope, the third one is page session scope, and the last one is page scope. Page scope, nothing but parameters which are declared within your JSP page itself. They are only accessible to your JSP page and not at all accessible outside the JSP page. These are used with respect to your custom tags. This is the last topic. We'll complete in another 10-15 minutes. The next last one is listener class. And the very important one is Servlet context listener. This is an interface. Normally, the purpose of a listener interface or listener classes. What is the purpose of going for listener classes? Let us say from our JSP or Servlet, we want to access database. So to access database, we know that we are supposed to load our driver into the memory. The next one is we need to create a connection object for each request, because we don't want to use the same connection object between the different client requests. But ultimately, the first step we are supposed to do is we need to load the driver into the memory. But if we write loading the driver within our service method nothing but your doGet or doPost method, then the driver will get loaded for each and every client request. Let us say that is not at all valid, because we don't want to load our driver for each and every client request. So you can't write the driver loading within your service method. Let us say you have written in initialization method call. But the initialization method is related to only a particular servlet, but not to different servlets. So that means you need to write the init method loading for each and every servlet. You are avoiding for each and every client request, that's okay. But the problem with writing within the init method is you need to write the same loading at each and every servlet level, because all your servlets need the database access. So that means this approach is also not valid. So normally what we'll use main method, which will perform one task, and once after that we'll make use of that object which got created within your main method and will perform all the database operations. Once a class has loaded into the memory by your main method, you will just ask the driver manager to get a connection and perform all the database operations. But currently we are working on advanced Java and we don't have main method with us. That's the purpose they have provided one another option, which is listener. There are several listener interfaces available, and the listener interfaces will get invoked during the application load, or you can say during the application deployment. The listener interface will consist of certain methods, and the container knows when to call those methods. Normally, the methods will get invoked during the application startup, and also will get invoked during the application shutdown. Nothing but whenever you are going to shut down your application server or web server. Main important, there are several listener interfaces available. One such is Servlet context listener. The context listener interface, this is an interface. You need to provide implementation because this is an interface. You need to implement the Servlet context listener and you need to override two methods. The first one is context initialized and the next one is context destroy. So as the name suggests, this will be called during the initialization. This will be called during the destruction. Nothing but just like how your destroy method will get called for your servlet. Let us go and write on listener, new listener. Select listener, com.user.listener, user listener, click on next. Previously I have mentioned that there are several types of listeners. You can see that these are all the listeners that are available. Currently we are going to use the first one, javax.servlet.servlet context listener. Servlet context attribute listener. The purpose of context attribute listener is, previously we have learned about Servlet context object and we have mentioned that we can add a new attribute to our context and we can remove some attribute from our context and also we can change the attribute as well. Attribute nothing but attribute value. So if you have written a Servlet context attribute listener, whenever you are performing those three operations like adding, deleting or modifying, your context attribute listener will get invoked by your Servlet container and it will provide you an option. If at all, if you want to perform any other changes, let us say you have modified some value which is available within your context object. If you want to perform some other information, some other notification kind of stuff, you can just implement Servlet context attribute listener and you can override those three methods and those methods will get called by your Servlet container. In the same way, HTTP session events, Servlet request events. You guys are supposed to take a look at each listener and identify what is the purpose of each and every listener. Normally, no other listener we are going to use, but just for your understanding. So select this one. Currently, I want to implement Servlet context listener. Once after that, you are going to override you are going to provide the definition for context initialized and context destroyed method. And you are supposed to configure your listener also within your web.xml file. This will be specified with only a single tag, which is listener tag, and you need to use listener class with fully qualified class name. If at all, if you haven't specified within your web.xml, your container won't be able to call this one during the startup. Context initialized method called for listener. Context destroyed method called for listener. So here you can just make use of class.forName, com.mysql.jdbc.driver.new instance, which will create an instance and make it available for your data JDBC connections. And the context initialized method accepts a parameter which is servlet context event. The servlet context event has the access to your servlet context. Currently we are working with respect to servlet context listener. The reason for that is I just want to get the parameters for the context level. So whatever the argument it was passing, it has the access to your servlet context. Take that into an object, sorry, reference. And after that, context dot get initialization parameter of, I guess the name is static data. Verify within your web.xml file. Param is context param. Context parameter. So normally this kind of constants we won't be writing within our Java code. You'll specify this within your web.xml and retrieve that parameter and pass it as an argument at this level. That's the reason I have used servlet context listener. Once to this, just go and execute our login.html file. This will redeploy my H2K servlet project. Within my logs, you can see that the listener has already called. You can see that context initialized method called for listener and context parameter 1000. So the listener will get invoked whenever you are deploying your application itself. That means just before handling any of the client requests, your listener method will get invoked. Now I'm stopping the Tomcat server. So here you can see that just before stopping the application, it has called the context destroyed method, and the context destroyed method called for listener. If you want to perform any kind of operations just before your shutdown, if you want to kill any of the user threads which you have created, you can just make use of the context destroyed method for your listener and you can stop those stuff. So the container will create a servlet context object, and this container will create a servlet context event as well. Whenever it has created a servlet context, it will read all the context parameters. Let us say these three are the context parameters, and then finally the container will verify are there any listener classes available. If at all, if there are any available, the container will create an instance of that. Go to your web.xml. So currently I have one listener class. The container will create an instance of that, and container will call the context initialized method by passing the servlet context event object, which has internally access to your servlet context object and the initialization parameters.
So many of our students have given testimonials on how our training programs are. You will find them on kudzu.com and on our website h2kinfosys.com. On our website h2kinfosys.com, you will also find more detailed information on who we are, the courses that we offer, what each course covers. Also, if you're interested in a demo program, please register on our homepage on the left-hand side. Just give us more information about yourself and we will send you a link for a demo class. The demo class is absolutely free. Experience our commitment by just attending an orientation workshop at no cost. Our team of faculty and advisors are here to guide you with the right information. If you still have more questions, please feel free to call us. Call us at 770-777-1269. This is a United States number. If you're calling from the UK, call us at 020-337-17615. You can also email us at training@h2kinfosys.com or h2kinfosys@gmail.com. Thank you for watching our videos. We wish you a great career in information technology.